KWT slaying.
Salama family, Salama, how y'all doing today? Yeah, today we're going to talk about the Hebrew language. I'm going to give you my perspective on the Hebrew language, where it's at, or is what we're speaking today Hebrew, things like that. So, but before we do that, I want to share my screen. Okay. So this is a post I made. I said Biblical Hebrew is an Afro-Asiatic Shemitic language, so that excludes that crappy modern Hebrew, aka Yiddish brew and Camp Hebrew. Look to Africa for remnants of the ancient biblical Hebrew language. If you are not looking at the African tribes for remnants of the language, then you are wasting your time. Reading Hebrew is not the same as speaking Hebrew. So, I have one guy from Africa. He was like, about time you admit your error. And it's like, I mean, most of y'all who follow us from the beginning, I already did a video years ago on the origins of the Hebrew language being in the Bantu language. The quality was poor, so I removed it. Right. So I got a response from my number one fan, Abu. Okay. Here's what Abu said. Sometimes people might get a bit ahead of themselves with certain ideas. How you like that? Of course, it is fair to say that there are a number of differences between biblical Hebrew and modern Israeli Hebrew. Okay, so he agreed with me, although he had to make a statement giving the impression that I am in error. But let's continue. It would be fair to argue for changes in pronunciation and even a loss of phonemes. It would be fair to note the many foreign loan words and even European influence neologisms in the latter. It would be fair to note that in practice, modern Israeli Hebrew syntax shows signs of Germanic influence, initially from Yiddish and then from English. Doesn't it sound like he's agreeing with me, y'all? I get the impression he agrees with me. Despite all that, however, it is seriously doubtful that there is a living language today which is closer to biblical Hebrew than is modern Israeli Hebrew. Did he not contradict himself just now? He just admitted it has Germanic influences, European influences. It's not Hebrew, right? That's what he just admitted. But now he's saying Israeli Hebrew is closer. Okay. Not even Arabic, despite how helpful it can be to the study of biblical Hebrew. Vague speculations are unhelpful. So he's making the assertion that my statement is vague without knowing what my full position is. If someone wishes to declare another living language to be closer to biblical Hebrew, they should present a case for such. If Teo Ministries wishes to present a meaningful argument in that regard, I would certainly be interested in exploring what they put forward. I'm not presenting anything for you. This is for the Israelite community. We don't care about you, Abu. You know we don't like you. You don't like us. I'm gonna keep it real. I'm trying to be decent about this, but this guy been stalking us for how many years? Okay. What the Negro community, the Israelite community, believes shouldn't matter to this man at all. Right? What do you care? Right? But what did he say? He said it's European influence. There are foreign loan words. Loan words meaning you took some words from another language and added it to yours. Okay. Right? So he's in agreement that what we are calling Hebrew got European influences, Germanic influences, Yiddish. That is not Hebrew. So how in that same word he can say um, Israeli Hebrew is the closest thing to biblical Hebrew? He's contradicting himself in that very thing. So, but we're going to get into this some more. Let me continue. All right. I always have issues with this slide presentation. There we go. All right. Okay. Bear with me. All right. Here we go. All right. So Hebrew language in search of a dead language. All right. So I mentioned Yiddish brew. I mentioned Camp Hebrew. What's Camp Hebrew? Right. Camp Hebrew is these made up terms, these words that we use, and it has taken a life of its own. Shalom, right? All of that. There's no foundation in that, in those words being defined as a Hebrew pronunciation, right? Phonetically wise. So, it's those kind of words that I call Camp Hebrew. All right, so let me continue here. Right. So, transliteration versus translation. So, before we begin, let's talk about translation versus transliteration. Is it possible to transliterate a dead language? All right. Okay, so here's a writing, an article about transliteration versus translation. Many people assume transliteration is equivalent to translation. However, there are some significant distinctions. Translation, put in simple terms, give you the meaning of a word that's written in another language. A transliteration doesn't tell you the meaning of the word, but it gives you an idea of how the word is pronounced in a foreign language. It makes a language a little more accessible to people who are unfamiliar with that language's alphabet. Many languages, such as Russian and Bulgarian, use the Cyrillic alphabet, while Japanese use kanji, and Hindi and Nepali use a Devanagari script. Transliteration converts these scripts into Latin letters, but it doesn't actually translate their meanings. Latin letters are used in some of the most common languages spoken around the world, including English, German, French, and Spanish. If the word good evening aren't transliterated from simplified Chinese in Latin letters, the simplified Chinese, right, this here, is almost impossible for anyone but a Mandarin speaker to understand. Transliterated into Latin, this word becomes Wan Shang Hao, which is much easier for us to pronounce. Those of us like exploring Chinese and Arabic speaking countries should be grateful that transliteration exists. Examples of transliteration. If you go to a Chinese restaurant in London, you often notice that their menu isn't written in English, but you can roughly guess the meaning. For example, wonton soup or chow mein. If chow mein is written in Mandarin Chinese, you would have no idea what those characters meant unless you were a Mandarin speaker, right? So, what's the key to understanding this? Being a native and a Mandarin speaker, someone who understands the language. Chinese restaurants help their customers by providing a transliteration of the simplified Chinese script into Latin letters to help you understand their menu, right? So we have a lot of groups, right? We have a lot of Gentile groups, Israelite groups that are telling us how to pronounce words that they are not native to. My question has always been, how do you know? How do you know where the vowel accents are meant to be? Explain that to me. You decided where you wanted to use "ow" versus "I" versus "e" versus "I." Break it down. Okay. This is what they're not doing. And everyone says they are experts in Hebrew. I'm like, I need some help here, fellas. Break it down for me. Okay. No one's doing that. Everybody got their own language. Everybody's saying they got the proof. So I'm giving my case as to why there's a problem with what everyone is trying to teach. Okay. So let's continue. So Paleo Hebrew alphabet. Paleo Hebrew script, also Paleo Hebrew, Proto Hebrew, Old Hebrew, is the writing system found in Canaanite inscriptions from the region of biblical Israel and Judah. It is considered to be the script used to record the original text of the Hebrew Bible due to its similarity to the Samaritan script, as the Talmud stated. Let's see. So I have here, it is not a language. Paleo Hebrew is a script, a writing system. So that's what we're seeing here. Paleo Hebrew is a writing system. It is a series of alphabets that produce a word, a sentence, for reading and writing. So you don't know by looking at looking at alphabets, looking at words created from those alphabets. You do not know how those words were pronounced. So Hebrew ceased to be a regular spoken language sometime between 200 400 CE, declining in the aftermath of the unsuccessful Bar Kokhba revolt that was carried out against the Roman Empire by the Jews of Judea. All right, so no one knows how the ancient Hebrews pronounced those words. But let's continue, because everybody telling me what those words sound like. All right. Oops, 1, 2, 4 there. Okay. All right. So here, this is from a book by Aaron M. Wilson Wright. Just give you an idea of the Canaanite script. The Canaanite languages include Ammonite, Amarna, Canaanite, Edomite, Hebrew, Moabite, Phoenician, and the languages of the Deir Allah plaster text. Okay. Hold on 1 second. All right. To continue. So just be clear, those letters don't only represent Hebrew writings, right? It's the writings of the Canaanites, the Ammonites, the Amarna, right? The Edomites, the Moabites, right? The Phoenicians, they all use that writing system. So when you see those writings, it doesn't necessarily mean it's Paleo Hebrew. All right, continue. So to continue from that same book, different page, all right? It has here, yeah, second most of the Canaanite languages are recorded in purely consonantal script, which makes it difficult to detect morphosyntactic changes that affected only vowels. So you don't really understand the inflections and changes of the vowel system, right? So everyone's telling you, Yahweh versus Yahuwah versus Yahweh, Jehovah, and it's not that straightforward. Okay, so that's one of the issues. Let's continue here. All right. So, oh, man, I'm hitting too fast here. Bear with. Look at that. Okay. All right. So there's 4 Hebrew scripts, right? Writing systems, not the pronunciation, not the language, not the spoken language, but the writing system. Hieroglyphic Hebrew, which was based on Egyptian characters, right? We have Paleo Hebrew, standardized by Samuel at Nile in 1050 BC, Aramaic Hebrew, and Mesoretic Hebrew, right? Which is the vowed Aramaic alphabet, Mesoretes, and modern Hebrew. So, not until 600 to 950 AD did you come into the Mesoretic text where you had the square Aramaic letters and the vowel points were added. All right. So you have to understand ancient Paleo Hebrew did not have vowel points. It's a consonantal based system, a language based on consonants. So unless you're a member of that group of people, you really don't know how those words were pronounced, right? So that's the challenge. That's the challenge for anyone trying to understand how the ancient Hebrews really spoke. Right. Man, this is just zooming by. What is this? Okay. Wow, I'm just tapping my thing and it's going by. All right. So we have the idea of an extinct, dead, or dormant language. All right. An extinct language is a language that no longer has any speakers, especially if the language has no living descendants. In contrast, a dead language is one that is no longer the native language of any community, even if it's still in use, like Latin. A dormant language is a dead language that still serves as a symbol of ethnic identity to a particular group. So, in my opinion, Paleo Ancient Hebrew, I feel, is an extinct language. That's there has been an attempt at resurrecting that extinct language. That's my opinion. But let's continue. All right. So here it says the Egyptian language or ancient Egyptian. Ancient Egyptian is an extinct Afro-Asiatic language, right? Hebrew is an Afro-Asiatic language. Egyptian is an Afro-Asiatic language that was spoken in ancient Egypt. It is known today from a large corpus of surviving texts, which were made accessible to the modern world following the decipherment of the ancient Egyptian scripts in the early 19th century, right? So y'all heard about the Rosetta Stone that allowed people to interpret and understand what we call ancient Egyptian script. Now, because we can read and interpret ancient Egyptian script, do we know how the ancient Egyptians spoke those words? Do we know the phonetics, the pronunciation of those words, those ancient Egyptian words? No, we don't. I contend the same issue applies to ancient Hebrew. There is no surviving Israelite that speaks Paleo Ancient Hebrew, Biblical Hebrew. All right. So we don't really know how they pronounce those words. And you can see even in the Old Testament, the northern tribe and southern tribe didn't even fully understand each other on the pronunciation of certain words, and that's in the Bible. All right. So let's continue. Now, William P. Griffin, he breaks it down the way I feel. All right. So he breaks it down, the things I've been trying to express here. Okay, but here, strictly speaking, classical biblical Hebrew is a dead language. My question in the beginning was, can we actually transliterate a dead language? Right? So the example, like with Chinese, when you look at the Chinese characters, you don't know what that means. What is that? But then when they take the Latin alphabets, you can sort of pronounce it in your language because they use your alphabets and your vowel system to give you the pronunciation of the Chinese words. Now, Chinese is a living language. It's not a dead language. So you got people who use Chinese who can tell you this is how we pronounce those words. You don't have ancient Hebrews who can tell you how to transliterate Paleo Hebrew. There's no one alive who speaks Paleo Hebrew. All right. And everyone's saying, I can speak Paleo Hebrew. And then they all sound like modern Hebrew. They all sound like Yiddish brew. And I'm like, how did you come to that conclusion when it's a dead language? How did you get to that? How did you get to that conclusion that you were going to put that vowel emphasis there, that you were going to use an ow instead of an ah? How did you get there? Right. No one's doing that. So, strictly speaking, classical biblical Hebrew is a dead language. It is as dead as Akkadian, Ugaritic, Sumerian, or Koine Greek. We are dealing with a fixed set of texts, not the Hebrew spoken in the nation of Israel today. Israeli Hebrew has significant differences from biblical Hebrew. While the verb forms are by and large biblical, not only were all the archaic forms of biblical Hebrew rejected, but also the consecutive tenses, the cohortative, the infinitive absolute more or less, and the infinitive construct, except for the plus, right? The lamed and plus bet infinitive forms. The syntax is heavily influenced by a combination of Mishnaic Hebrew and European languages. Some biblical vocabulary is either rejected or substantially modified as to its usage. And it has been calculated that some 10% of the words in Hebrew dictionaries might be of what? Foreign, usually Western origin. That's a loan word. Further, the pronunciation system is basically Sephardic, not Ashkenazic or Yemenite. All right, give me 1 second. I'm going to turn on the banner. So let's continue. All right. So he continues, he says, however well the Masoretes preserved a pronunciation and interpretive tradition, vowel points are not original. So the Israeli Hebrew, he said these vowel points are not original. This should be important whether one views the Hebrew Bible as Holy Scripture. It is only the consonantal text that was canonized. So what was accepted and canonized was the consonantal text, not the vowel points that have been applied to these words, or sees the text as a source of information for constructing the history of the religion of Israel. People wrote, read, and learned Hebrew in ancient times up through the latter part of the first millennium CE without vowel pointing. So when they learned Hebrew, they weren't using vowel pointing. They looked at the characters and they knew how to pronounce those words, right? Similarly, Masoretic pointing should be treated with a skeptical eye, whether one uses it for pronunciation or interpretation. The Masoretes apply a fairly consistent pronunciation system to a collection of texts that cover, depending upon your perspective, up to 1,000 years. It would be difficult to argue that any language maintained the same pronunciation over a 1,000-year period. So language is evolving, pronunciations do change, or even 500 years, let alone Hebrew. Further, even consonantal indicators in the Hebrew Bible, such as the Sibboleth and the Shibboleth, shows that pronunciation differences existed at the same time in different regions, right? So even when they were using those words, they had different pronunciations, right? Just like I mentioned, there's a reference. I think it might have been in Numbers. Maybe Minister Yacoba could remind me. But the Northern tribe, they were like, you can tell how they pronounce a certain word to determine whether or not they're from the Northern tribe versus Judah, Southern tribe. Even if one concludes that Tiberian pointing is in the ballpark, some Greek sources provide evidence that some ancient vowel patterns do not match that of the Masoretic text. First, the vocalization of proper names in the Septuagint sometimes reflects different pronunciations, e.g., often A for I, O for I, or U, monosyllabic pronunciations of Segolese. Jerusalem is pronounced M, not Ayim. Bethel instead of Bet-El. Melchizedek, not Melchizedek. Second, remains of the second column of Origen's hexapla show pronunciation differences. Finally, while Jerome's transliterations reflect a tradition closer to the Masoretic text, there nevertheless are significant differences. So you see, it's not straightforward. There's different vowel expressions depending on region, language. No one's an original in the first place, right? So it could be some use a I, some use a I, some use O, some use A, right? So unless you are native to that culture, who's passing that language down? So Masoretic pointing preserves a liturgical reading for a text that by and large was not intended to be read liturgically. This includes odd features such as in pause, where pronunciation changes because of the word's position in a verse. Lach, falika, which looks like a feminine form being used in place of a masculine one. So depending on the position of the word, changes its meaning. Just like I was our brother from Ganyama Ministries, I think, yeah, that's how you pronounce it. He did a whole video on their language and how you can just the tense of your voice on a certain word changes the meaning, right? So if you raise your voice, that same word is different than when you say it in a lower tone, right? You have those same experiences here, according to him. Right. Once again, the Tiberian pointing in the Masoretic text is only one of three pointing systems, which indicates that there was disagreement over what was correct pronunciation. So there's three different pointing systems where people apply their vowel points on these consonantal letters, and they're different. Three different accents on those vowels, right? Three different ones. So just as he said, there were disagreements on the pronunciation. Just because it happened to win broad acceptance does not mean that it should be uncritically accepted as authoritative. So when y'all have a lot of people out here telling y'all they know Hebrew, y'all got a lot of people up here telling you how to pronounce a word, and this brother just told you there's three different vowel expressions and they don't even agree. So I think we need to understand the history of this language, right? Even those who claim to be us in the land today are not speaking biblical Hebrew. All right, let's continue. Okay. What is Sephardic Hebrew? Sephardic Hebrew is the pronunciation system, right? System, right? Lettering system, pronunciation system. Yeah, how they pronounce it for biblical Hebrew. So this is how they choose to speak Hebrew, right? Just like you got an Ashkenazic system, you got a Sephardic system, right? Biblical Hebrew favored for liturgical use by Sephardi Jewish practice. Its phonology was influenced by contact languages such as Spanish, Judeo-Spanish, Arabic, Portuguese, and modern Greek. So the pronunciation system by the so-called Sephardi Jews, right? Not the ones taken as slaves and sent to the islands, not the ones taken to Africa during the Inquisition, right? The real Sephardi Jews, but the ones acknowledged by the European powers. They have their own pronunciation system that's based off of Spanish, Arabic, Portuguese, and Greek. So if once again we got potential loan words in play, right? What they call calques, all right? And we're going to see that. But anyway, they created a pronunciation system based on other cultural languages. So how is this Hebrew as well? How do you conclude that? All right, so Sephardic script influenced by Ladino, right? So Ladino was one of the Sephardic scripts, and Pastor Kelly did a whole teaching on that. If you guys want to understand Ladino, the origin of Ladino, it's a Spanish Hebrew handwritten language that has its origins in Spain, right? So it's a mixture of the Spanish culture and language, right? It's a mixture with that in Hebrew, right? So you can see this here. So Professor Chaim Rabin, A Short History of Hebrew Language. At the very outset, the student of Hebrew meets with maxims from the Talmud, stories from the Midrash about the patriarchs, etc. It may even read portions of the ethics of the fathers. If he is at all sensitive to language, he cannot fail to notice that in those texts he is faced with a language very different from that of the what? Bible. But when the same student learns something of the history of the Hebrew literature, he will discover that the latest books of the Bible, such as Esther and Colette, were composed only a short time, about 100 years before the lifetime of the earliest sages mentioned in the Mishnah, such as Simeon the Just or Jose ben Hosea. Maybe he was already heard of the dead. Maybe he already heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls and knows that for the most part they are in a language closely resembling that of the Bible. Although, according to the most widely accepted dating, their composition took place after the time of Simeon the Just. Moreover, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is one text written on a copper strip in a Hebrew rather similar to that used by the sages of the Mishnah. He did, I'm sorry, how did it come about that Hebrew, to all appearances, underwent such a complete change in such a short time? The question has been much discussed, and many different solutions have been offered. One says that the language of the Mishnaic sages did not really exist. Biblical Hebrew, according to that view, had died before their time, and the sages spoke Aramaic. When they tried to write down their teachings in Hebrew, all they succeeded in producing was a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic, which is Mishnaic Hebrew. So Mishnaic Hebrew is a mixture of Aramaic and Hebrew, right? So in that context, a lot of the Israelites, because of mixing and slavery, their language got mixed with some Hebrew and the dominant culture at that time, right? So Aramaic and Hebrew, right? And so that's what Mishnaic Hebrew is. So even in that case, we have a different set of Hebrew words and languages, and it has a different pronunciation. And so, this is another category of what they call Hebrew, right? They ain't just one category. You got Mishnaic Hebrew, you got Sephardic Hebrew, you got Ashkenazic Hebrew, right? So, which one are we talking about when people say biblical Hebrew, right? All right. Of the sages was indeed a living spoken language, and that the sages wrote as they talked. The change of language, however, was not as sudden as might appear at first glance. The apparently abrupt change only took place superficially in the written language, but at the back of it, there was a slow, gradual change in the spoken language. True, in the period of the Maccabees, people still wrote in the Hebrew of the Bible, but an expert examining the latest books of the Bible can discern that it was no longer the natural language of the books written in the period of the First Temple. One can see that the authors of the later books were not sure of themselves in using the language correctly and tried to imitate the style of the writers of the time of the kings of Judah and Israel, not always successfully. It is assumed, therefore, that although they learned in school to write biblical Hebrew, their written usage was not backed by living speech in the same form of language. But in daily life, they used another kind of language. This was Mishnaic Hebrew. So we see here, right? They tried to apply what they knew, what they learned in school, to the ancient biblical kings of Judah and Israel. They tried to apply that to the language and just basically created a hodgepodge of languages. And so it said too, their written usage. So they knew how to write Hebrew just like we can today. We can write it. We got that. We can write it, right? But their written usage was not backed by living speech. Nobody could speak it the way it was supposed to be spoken, right? And this is the problem I see today. This is what I'm talking about. Nobody knows how to pronounce those words, period. Right? Just like when we deal with DNA, it's a complex thing. We're dealing with ancient history. We're dealing with what they call a dead language, and it was attempted to be revived, but there is no known speakers of the original language. The language also naturally evolved. There's no living speech, right? They don't know the form of the language anymore. Right? So, why is Hebrew a dead language? But when the Romans destroyed the second Jewish temple in 70 CE, Hebrew began to die out. It was essentially completely dead 65 years later in 135, after the failure of Bar Kokhba revolt, when Roman Emperor Hadrian expelled, enslaved, or killed most of Israel's remaining Jews, the final native Hebrew speakers. All right, so Hadrian wiped out everybody. Anyone who knew how to speak Hebrew, they were few in number, right? Let's continue. We're gonna learn about this one person here. Okay. All right, let's see here. The Paleo-Hebrew alphabet was used between about 1000 BC and 135 AD to write ancient Hebrew in the biblical region of Israel and Judah. It developed from the Proto-Canaanite script, which was used in Canaan and the Levant during the Late Bronze Age. Paleo-Hebrew is also known as Proto-Hebrew or Old Script Hebrew, right? So it's a dead language, right? It's a dead language just by here, JewishUnpacked.com. Many other references tell you it's a dead language. So where are you getting these pronunciations from? Everyone tell you they got the perfect pronunciation. They know exactly how those words sound. I disagree. I just ask a lot of questions. That's what I do. So now, see this here? This is about Eliezer ben Yehuda. I had this about 4 or 5 years ago. I grabbed this from Wiki. About a month or two after I did my show using this quote, they altered it, but I have it right here. You can see I didn't create this myself, but let's read it. The revival of the Hebrew language was led by Eliezer ben Yehuda in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Modern Hebrew used biblical Hebrew morphemes, Mishnaic spellings, Sephardic pronunciations, right? So far, we know what Sephardic pronunciations are. It got Spanish, it got Arabic, it got Greek, right? So they already admit they're using a little pronunciation that's not tied to the Hebrew people, right? Idioms and calques are loan words. Idioms and calques were made from what? Yiddish. Its acceptance by the early Jewish immigrants to Ottoman Palestine was primarily due to support from the organization of Edmund James de Rothschilds in the 1880s. So with the help of James de Rothschilds, modern Hebrew was allowed to be revived, according to them. But it's not ancient Hebrew. They use Sephardic pronunciation. They use Mishnaic spellings. They use loan words, which means they came from foreign languages. So they built a Hebrew language based on other cultures' languages. So how is this Hebrew, family? Okay. So I'm going through this because in my next teaching, we're going to get into where the biblical language should be located from. And as I stated, it should be found in Africa somewhere. But let's continue. All right. So I'm going to play this video here. Give me a second. And we're going to see how Germans and Yiddish speakers understand one another. So how is that the case? Because we know that Hebrew is made up of Yiddish, right? Those long words that come from Yiddish and European language. So give me 1 second here. Ooh.
First one.
Okay, no problem. I'm gonna actually start with the easiest one. This one has no Hebrew at all because I know Hebrew as well, so I know which words come from Hebrew in Yiddish. So this one, there's no Hebrew. So I'm actually curious if you're gonna be able to understand everything. It's an expression. Yiddish has a lot of very interesting expressions. So his expression is like this: a Mensch tracht und Gott lacht. So
Okay.
one, I'm not sure if you're able to understand that.
Ein Mensch
Can you repeat that, please?
Yes. A Mensch, a is two words. A Mensch tracht und Gott lacht.
Okay. So literally, I would translate it like ein Mensch lach. No, it was tracht. Tracht, you
Tracht,
said.
tracht.
In English, it would be a human. Yeah, tracht. And God is laughing.
Yeah,
So,
you got it.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you just don't know the tracht. The tracht means in Yiddish means thinking.
So in German would be like dacht. So denken, thought. He thought about.
Oh, is with a D? Would be dacht.
Dacht, yes.
Dacht. Wow, interesting. Okay. Dach in Yiddish, dach is with no T in the end. Dach means roof.
Yeah, in German too.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. So it's a saying like a Mensch tracht und Gott lacht. A person, because people make plans and all that, but in the end of the day, like things don't work out exactly the way you want. Like God laughs at your plans.
Now we'll do the first German one and see how you.
Let's go.
Okay, let's go. The first one would be, ich gehe mit meinem Opa und meinem Vater ins Stadion und schaue ein Spiel von unserem Lieblingsverein, Werder Bremen.
Okay, I caught something. My grandfather and my father in a stadium, and
Mhm.
Spielen is playing. Spielen in Yiddish is playing either music or a sport or anything.
Yeah.
And can you say it again?
Ich gehe
Ich
Mit-
gehe, I go.
mhm,
I go. Okay.
mit meinem Opa, my grandfather,
With my
that's what you
grandfather.
already know, und meinem Vater ins
And my father.
Stadion.
In what? In what?
Stadion.
Okay, we can leave it at that. But as you can see, modern Hebrew does have Yiddish calques, which is long words, and a lot of references in Yiddish. And as you can see, Yiddish and German are brother languages. So let's continue. Okay, let me share my screen again. Okay, so back to where we were. All right. So let's continue here. Right. I have here an idiom, a group of words established by usage as having a meaning not deducible from those of the individual words, right? Rain, cats, and dogs, etc. Right. And that comes from here. Idioms, calques were made from Yiddish. So a calque, otherwise known as a loan translation, is a word or phrase taken from one language and translated literally word for word into another language. So that's those loan words, right? So they basically, I can take a word from, let's say, the Zulu, right, the Xhosa language, and I can add it to modern Hebrew if they didn't think it had any relation to Hebrew, and I could add it and make it part of what they call modern Hebrew, even though, tell you the truth, Xhosa has remnants of Hebrew in it. Now, this is Paul Wexler. He's a Jew, I think, Tel Aviv scholar, right? And let's see what he has to say. Right. Modern Hebrew, which first became a spoken language in the late 19th century among a small group of native Yiddish speakers, should hold considerable interest for Slavists. Yet few students of Slavonic or Hebrew are aware of the links between the histories of the two languages. Almost all early Hebrew language planners in the late 19th century and a sizable number of Jewish immigrants to Palestine and Israel for more than a century were speakers of a Slavonic language, mainly Polish and or Eastern Slavonic, and Yiddish, which is Eastern Europe, was heavily Slavicized. Hence, Slavonic languages have been in a position to influence the norms of the modern Hebrew, either directly or through the intermediary of Yiddish. So when you're looking at the modern phonetics of Hebrew, and everyone's using that today, right? Because Mishpoha, for example, is a European-based language, right? Slavonic kind of language that has no true Hebrew tie. And that's a lot of the language that is used and pronounced today. So a lot of the so-called Hebrew Israelite teachers are speaking this language as well, right? Why? Because modern Hebrew is an African language, Afro-Asiatic language. And let me make this clear. We have clearly verified, produced a lot of receipts on who the biblical Hebrew Israelites are. We got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of European reference material, books, collegiate historical references, clearly identifying the Negro as the biblical Hebrew Israelite. So out of those hundreds of books, if those people are the ancient Jews, the ancient Hebrew Israelites, if that's the case, then don't they have the true remnants of the biblical language? So anyone that believes that we have not made our case with those historical references, I challenge you to go against those references from those collegiate references, right? Those Ivy League references, and prove us wrong, because you can't win. All right. So we can assume, based on the research that we've done, right, that the Negro is the biblical Israelite. If the Negro is the biblical Israelite, where should the language source be in Africa with the biblical Hebrew Israelites, right? So everyone else has been speaking what they have been taught, right? Everyone's been speaking this Israeli language that has Slavonic, Yiddish, European origins, and claiming it's Hebrew. And tell you the truth, in my opinion, you must begin at ground zero and start over and look to the African culture. All right, let's continue. Wexler goes on. The presence of Slavonic loans, right, loanwords, patterns of discourse, and affixal machinery is not what prompts me to speak of a Slavonic standard in modern Hebrew. I speak of a Slavonic standard in modern Hebrew for two reasons. Modern Hebrew prefers Slavonic forms of new international loans. In other words, vocabulary borrowed from Greek and Latin, or most often constructed from Greek and Latin roots by speakers of other European languages. All right, so this is what I'm telling you guys. Mishpoha, Mishnah, this is European-based phonetics, right? It has nothing to do with biblical Hebrew at all. We're not speaking those languages. Okay, I'm going to show you something at the end, right? And I'm going to show you how you can take this language that I'm going to show you and use it to and claim that this language is Hebrew, right? But that's going to be at the end. Let's continue. To non-Slavonic surface cognates, Slavonic patterns of derivation are also combinable with international roots which did not enter Hebrew from a Slavonic source language. By productively using Slavonic morphological processes to integrate a host of loans received from where? Non-Slavonic donor languages, Hebrew speakers are in effect creating a sizable pseudo-Slavonic vocabulary in their language. So all them languages I'm telling you is pseudo-Slavonic languages, Greek and Latin, added to this so-called Hebrew. A Slavonic standard is characteristic of the speech of all Hebrew speakers, regardless of ethno-linguistic background or fluency in Slavonic language. Since the 1880s, Hebrew language planners have been seeking to create a spoken and modernized written norm for a language which, lacking spoken function for some 1600 years, was intended to be spoken and written language of a new society in the old new homeland of the Jews, Palestine. What did he say? No one has spoken this language for 1600 years. They were looking to revive it. That's basically what he was saying. All right. The Zionists were particularly anxious to have Hebrew supplant Yiddish. the language spoken by the Eastern European Jewish masses from whose ranks Hebrew nationalists hoped to recruit the first Jewish immigrants to Palestine. A priority of the Hebrew language regulators was the cultivation of Old Hebrew roots from native texts, mainly the Bible and Mishnaic literature written approximately between 1000 BC to AD 200. This policy meant that Yiddish could not be a productive source of enrichment for modern Hebrew, and that even innovative forms of Hebraism in Yiddish could not be recommended for canonization in modern Hebrew. Most, if not all, language planners were probably unaware of the fact that many unique Yiddish Hebraisms reflected ancient colloquial Hebrew norms, which are hardly recoverable from old texts. Thus, innovative Yiddish Hebraisms such as Y, Megazine, exaggerate, and Mekozrin sources with in plural were replaced in modern Hebrew by magzim. So they replaced the em with the im, the zim. Megazim means only a prune, and mekarat was the plural. So ancient Hebrew, according to this guy, properly ends in the at for the plural form, but in modern Hebrew, it ends in the im, right? In, right? Mizra, He's saying Mizra, at. Mekorat. Okay, so let's continue. However, the old Hebrew sources were too scant to meet fully the needs of early modern Hebrew. Hence, speakers had to turn occasionally, in spite of their language policies, to their native language. So they went to their native language to help understand how they were going to revive this new version of Hebrew, which was Slavonized Yiddish, Polish, and or Eastern Slavonic languages, though many Hebrew language planners envisaged this enrichment as temporary, pending the coinage of Hebrew neologisms. As a partial counterweight to Slavonic, there were occasional calls for Arabic and other Old Semitic enrichment. So you can see how in some Hebrew words there's similarity to Arabic because they've integrated it into modern Hebrew. But these largely went unheeded since most Hebrew speakers were unfamiliar with these languages. Yet Slavonic influences had to be carefully controlled so as not to create convergence with the Slavonic component of Yiddish. Thus, to some extent, it was primarily the negative attitude of early Hebrew speakers to Yiddish and the desire to avoid convergence with the Slavonic and Hebrew norms of Yiddish that led Hebrew language planners to create a unique Slavonic standard. So you hear many of the Jewish languages, for example, Yiddish, Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-Arabic, assign the Hebrew plural marker in to Hebrew nouns, where Old Written Hebrew preferred the ending of at. So like I told you previously, right? At was the plural in ancient biblical days, according to him, but modern Hebrew uses the in. Modern Hebrew has resurrected the latter distribution of plural markers. For details, see Wexler, The Role of Yiddish. So I ask you, can the pronunciations used by the Israelis or by the Hebrew Israelite community today be based on biblical Hebrew, based on the evidence presented? Since biblical Hebrew is based on a Canaanite language, which is a consonant-only based language, who decides where the vowel point should be added? Who decided what vowel should be applied to a word? Who had the authority to determine the pronunciation of a language that was considered dead, according to all scholars? All right, so here's a video I'm going to play for you guys. And my question to you is, if I take the Aramaic alphabet, right, them square alphabets, and then apply the language in this video, can we call this ancient Hebrew? Because I simply determined that the language contains if I determine that the language contains the proper phonetics. So I'm saying, can I take use this language in this video as loan words to create Hebrew? Let's look at it. So my question is, can I use this language, use the long words from this language, and create Hebrew? Right? That's what they did. They took it from other languages, Greek, Yiddish, Latin. Why can't I do this? Now you watch this. I think I forgot to share the audio. I'm pretty sure I did. Let me do that again. All right. The Our Father in Klingon. Why can't I do it? I'm asking. Why can't I create Celts from this and add it to the Hebrew language? Why not?
Shutova Kordak, Dabo, Bafma, Honglij, Kumochlu Judge, Wotlij, Turtle Judge, Shutova Kor, Rechoch Judge Jura, Chutlij, Lulukmu, Dach Judge Tier, Nukmans, Knubnis, Edge Inne Manchmo, Kobitsis Ho, Machvad Imbognus Poo, Tipitch Betmo, Flutmochnis Ho, als Miguevo, Klutognis. Rech Suchva Tachmawol, Hostjay, Bosjay, Kachtajwol, Gustans.
Now, I guess there's a little humor to that, right? But you know, my point is, can I do what they did? Can I do what they did and create a new Hebrew? Right? Can I do that? Can I apply Klingon and languages and call it Hebrew? All right. So excuse me. All right. So next time, I'm at the end of part 1. This is part 1. Part 2, we're going to get into the African languages, the Bantu languages, the Niger-Congo languages, and we're going to see why they have as much, if not more, validity at being the ancient Hebrew language. So next time, we will discuss a few African languages and see if these languages have any ties to the biblical Hebrew language. Take note that there is zero doubt that many African tribes are known to be Jews, even by Israelis today, right? They go into Africa and they identify many of the African tribes as Jews. If these members of these tribes are Jews, should they not have part of the ancient language, right? The issue is, according to the history, we see thousands of people in West Africa, part of these tribes that the scholars have identified as Jews, right? Many West African tribes. We also have the Limba, which is in South Africa and East Africa. We got the Igbo and the Yoruba, right? And according to DNA, Igbo and Yoruba got 99.9% the same DNA, right? So these groups have been identified by independent Israeli organizations as being Jews. So if that's the case, and we have the references in the old books that reaffirm that the Jews, the biblical Israelites, were a black people, we see that these tribes have the traditions that we see in the Bible, like libations, right? Like 8-day circumcision. We have all of these traditions carried over into these tribes. Could they not have carried over the original language? Now, we got to admit the original language has evolved. Has evolved over years. The Israelites were persecuted. The Israelites were chased all over the planet, all over Africa. They gave up the language and tried to assimilate into the Arabic cultures for the most part. They were abused, right? So a lot of it may have disappeared, but some of these tribes, I guarantee you, have part of the original language. You know, Genyame, if you guys go to his video, he did a video on the name of God, which seems to tie back to the biblical references. So I'm telling you, we got to look at Africa. We got to look at the tribes that have been identified as being Israelites, who our DNA ties back to, right? So in the next video, I'm going to get into that. We're going to get into the evidence that's available or could be available for identifying the biblical language, right? We're going to find remnants of it. We're going to find remnants of it. All right. So that's all I have, everyone. And I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I'll see you next time.